On April 12, 1861, an awe finally erupted when Beauregard at last opened fire on Fort Sumter. The bombardment lasted 34 hours, with more than 4,000 shells fired. Despite the ferocity of the bombardment, not a single Union soldier was killed during the action. At 2:30 p.m. on April 13, 1861, they surrendered the fort under agreeable terms and marched from the fort, carrying the flag which had endured the battle. For Lincoln, the loss of Fort Sumter was a kind of symbolic victory. While losing the fort was not ideal, the public in the North rallied behind him, and the Union states like New Jersey and Delaware, which had been, for a time, on the fence regarding secession, threw their support wholeheartedly toward the Union. Lincoln used the momentum carried by the battle to call for 75,000 volunteers willing to help restore order in the South and return these secessionist states to the Union. The North answered the call, and in days, the ranks were beginning to fill. In Ohio, so many men volunteered that they could have met the full 75,000 volunteers on their own in the South. The victory at Fort Sumter did less to inspire a call to arms than did Lincoln's call for volunteers. The call for 75,000 volunteers triggered the secession of 4 additional states: Virginia, Tennessee, Arkansas, and North Carolina. To the South, it was clear that Lincoln planned to use the federal government to coerce them back into the Union by blood in the North. It was clear that the South had violated the Constitution by seceding, and it was within the power of the federal government to take back the states. Again, the question of the power of the government created great consternation and powerful opinions from both sides. Amidst it all remained the question at the heart of the war: slavery. It was clear now to the leaders of the rebellion that if Lincoln had the power to raise an army of volunteers to return the states to the Union, he could use that power to end slavery in the United States for good if the Confederacy did not achieve victory early on. There was no chance of success for them in the long run. A protracted and costly war may wear down the North eventually, but the South did not have the means to conduct such a conflict, nor would they survive if they did. General Winfield Scott, the veteran of the War of 1812 and the Mexican-American War, was given command of Union forces. At the onset of the war, Scott was an excellent tactician, although his experience on the battlefield was outdated. He implemented a full-scale naval blockade of the South, known as the Anaconda Plan, which he hoped would help hasten the end of the war by choking the South of the many resources it would need to run the war. However, goods were still making their way into the South through Texas. The Union had a clear view of their strategic goals from this point forward. In the East, defeat the Confederate Army in the field, capture major coastal cities along the East Coast, and capture the new Confederate capital in Richmond. Virginia in the West, capture major cities and forts along the Mississippi River, and cut off Texas from the rest of the South. For the South, the path to success was on the battlefield. There was, in which the South could match the North in terms of industry manpower or naval power. Aid could come in the form of help from Europe. But France and England had abolished slavery decades prior and would never meaningfully commit to the South during the conflict. This meant that the Confederates needed swift and decisive victories against the Union, possibly on Northern soil. If the cost of war was too high, the Peace Democrats and more moderate Republicans in Congress might pull the Union out of the war. In the Eastern theater of the war, early Confederate successes kept the rebellion alive. As a revolving door of Union high commanders continued to plague the Federal forces, Confederate General Robert E. Lee, who had declined command of Union forces at the war's outbreak in favor of supporting his home state of Virginia, emerged as the tactical and logistical genius behind the survival of the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia. We kept the cause of the Confederacy alive as long as his army was in the field, and responded effectively and swiftly to the often cumbersome and uncertain Union forces. He opposed in the West Union General Ulysses S. Grant emerged as the best chance for the North's success. Grant waged a series of incredible campaigns against his opponents in the West and managed to take control of the Mississippi River, putting a wedge between Texas and the other southern states. Grant's greatest victory in the West came with the Siege of Vicksburg, ending in July 1863 at the same time. General Lee had invaded Pennsylvania in the east with the intention of breaking the spirit of the North and forcing Lincoln to surrender. Instead, he was soundly defeated at the Battle of Gettysburg by Union General George Meade. Between Lee's defeat at Gettysburg and Grant's victory at Vicksburg, the high tide of the Confederacy was over. In 1862, after the Battle of Antietam, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, claiming that slavery was abolished within those parts of the country which had rebelled against the Union, and allowed the Union Army to take on any slaves found in the South and bring them north. Lincoln, in the War Department, authorized the raising of black troops, known as colored troops, during the Civil War. While the war had begun for Lincoln as a means to reunite the country, as it progressed, he struck at the heart of the conflict and shifted the war goals beyond simply a return to the status quo. Lincoln believed slavery could not and would no longer exist within the borders of the United States, and organized his party to begin working on amendments to the Constitution to make it so. Grant was given command of the entire Union Army and was moved to command the Eastern theater of the war. He left General William Tecumseh Sherman in command of the Western theater, and the two began to prosecute total war against the South. Grant threw his army repeatedly at Lee, forcing engagement after engagement. While Lee did win several battles, they were battles he could not afford to fight. And even when Grant lost, he moved swiftly. Unlike his predecessors, and immediately got back into the frame in the West. Sherman moved south, cutting through the South toward Atlanta, Georgia, leaving a path of devastation in his wake. Atlanta was burned as Confederate forces fled before Sherman's army. Unable to stop the Union juggernaut, Sherman marched his armies to Savannah by Christmas of 1864 and presented the captured city to President Lincoln. As a gift in spring 1865, Lee was finally defeated for the last time at Appomattox Courthouse and surrendered to Grant on April 9, 1865. Sherman continued to chase the Confederate forces in the Carolinas north until they too surrendered shortly thereafter, after 4 years and 600,000 lives lost. The Civil War was at last over. Before it had ended, Lincoln had successfully managed to convince Congress to pass the 13th, the amendment to the Constitution, in January 1865, officially abolishing slavery in the United States. Lincoln advocated for peace and hoped that the Reconstruction period that would inevitably follow would be guided not by malice, but by a sense of unity. The country was optimistic that Lincoln would be the one to lead them. It was not to be Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States, was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, a radical Southern supporter, and died on the morning of April 15, 1865. Booth was hunted down and killed during the manhunt, while his co-conspirators were rounded up and executed for treason. The country mourned the loss of their leader, and the fate of Reconstruction was left in the hands of Lincoln's vice president, Andrew Johnson. Reconstruction began immediately after the end of the Civil War, and the South was separated into 5 military districts. These districts were occupied by U.S. troops in order to help re-establish law and order in the region, as well as enforce the new laws of Reconstruction. Over the course of 5 years, the Congress successfully passed an additional 2 constitutional amendments to secure the rights of the now free black citizens of the United States. The first, the 14th Amendment, granted the right of citizenship to all those born within the United States, and granted those citizens the right of equal protection under the law. The second, the 15th Amendment, guaranteed citizens the right to vote, regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. The resentment of many individuals in both North and South grew as the U.S. government expanded the rights and liberties of Black Americans to match those of white Americans, especially in regions deeply affected by the Civil War. In the South, groups of white supremacists rose up and formed several hate organizations, such as the Ku Klux Klan or the KKK, which targeted Black Americans and other individuals who favored Reconstruction. In 1868, Ulysses S. Grant, hero of the Civil War, was elected the 18th President of the United States and took office in March 1869. Grant committed much of his early years as president to Lincoln's original goals of Reconstruction, signing numerous acts ensuring naturalization and equal rights of black citizens. To enforce these acts and the new constitutional amendments, he created the Justice Department and wielded the U.S. military to stamp out the KKK and other white supremacist organizations. Sadly, Grant's presidency was wrought with political turmoil, from both within his own party and without. The newly reformed governments of the southern states lashed out at the Reconstruction laws and continuously caused issues during elections. Grant found his hands tied as his second term came to an end, and the country began its return to stalemate and compromise as the economic and business interests of both parties began to usurp the social crises of Reconstruction. With the end of the American Civil War and the question of slavery at last resolved, many people within the United States continued the exodus out west in the footsteps of the early 19th century pioneers. With the territories along the West Coast fairly well established and a growing number of cities dotting the Midwest, moving away from the chaos of the East Coast, and the memory of the war was appealing. Access to the West had only grown over the course of the mid-19th century with the introduction of the Transcontinental Railroad. From 1863 to 1869, a transcontinental railroad was built to connect the eastern and western coasts of the U.S. The very first steam train had debuted in 1830, and by more than 9,000 miles of track had been laid. In 1860, it was decided that the mountain pass, where the Donner Party had been trapped, was an ideal place for a railroad to cut through the Sierra Nevada mountains. When President Abraham Lincoln signed the Pacific Railroad Act into law, in 1862 construction commenced. Though railroad workers suffered attacks from members of the Sioux, Arapaho, and Cheyenne tribes as they progressed across the land. Wherever the railroad went, ramshackle settlements of the sort immortalized in Wild West culture were soon to follow. These places were hotbeds for drinking, gambling, prostitution, and violence. When construction of the Transcontinental Railroad finished at Promontory Summit, north of the Great Salt Lake in Utah, a final spike made of 17.6 karat gold was ceremoniously driven into the ground before a crowd of workers and dignitaries. With the railroad's completion, the travel time for making the 3,000-mile journey across the United States was cut from months to under a week. This made the economic export of Western resources to Eastern markets easier and increased the speed of westward expansion as settlers entered newly accessible territories. Conflicts with Native Americans increased. During this time, the exploits, both real and exaggerated, of notorious outlaws gained the perpetrator's infamy at the time and an enduring legacy today. Wyatt Earp, former Marshal of Dodge City, Kansas moved to Tombstone, Arizona Territory, in 1879 with several of his brothers, in search of riches from the silver boom. While there, the Earps ran into a gang of outlaws called the Cowboys, led by Ike Clinton. The Earps all have law enforcement backgrounds, with Virgil Earp acting as both town marshal for Tombstone and as a deputy U.S. Marshal. They teamed up with the temporary policeman Doc Holliday. The lawman had a long-standing feud with the Clanton gang, but things came to a head when Virgil made the decision to enforce a city ordinance prohibiting carrying weapons in town, which meant disarming the gun-toting cowboys. This intervention led to the shootout at the OK Corral, a 30-second gunfight that nevertheless became symbolic of the Old West, a time when the frontier was virtually lawless, as a consequence of lawmen being spread incredibly thin over vast territories. The beginning of the Gilded Age, a period characterized as much by wealth and abundance as by poverty and corruption, was in fact a notable ending. The year 1877 marked the end of Reconstruction, and therefore an end to one of the greatest periods of civil rights reform in the country's history. Efforts by the federal government to help protect the rights given to African Americans after the end of the Civil War were abandoned as a result of a compromise struck to settle the contested 1876 election between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden Hayes. A North Republican was granted the presidency and Reconstruction was ended. Federal troops were withdrawn from the South, no longer interfering to protect African American civil and political rights. The systemic violence, disenfranchisement, and oppression that followed would persist for more than a century and come to be called Jim and Crow, as the federal government gave up on its promise to give free black men the rights of citizens in the South. Sharecropping and low-wage work, such as domestic servitude, were some of the only options available to freed people in the South. But depending on who you were, what you looked like, and where in the country you were, economic opportunity could abound. In Gilded Age America, cheap land and relatively high wages, compared to other parts of the world, drew in immigrants by the millions. Between 1877 and 19 approximately 7.3 million people immigrated into the United States. Prior to 1880, most came from Western Europe and China. But closer to the turn of the century, more immigrants came from Southern and Eastern Europe. They settled in every area of the country, in large numbers, except for the economically devastated South. But their appearance triggered political and social backlash from Americans who felt their white, Protestant country was being threatened. Movements to resist certain types of immigrants, including Catholics, Jews, and Chinese, gained momentum in the West. Sentiments against Chinese workers were particularly hostile, and mobs were known to gather and attack Chinese, all living in areas of Wyoming and Washington. Driving them out, Congress restricted Chinese immigration to the U.S. beginning in 1892, continuing to uphold the policy until a permanent exclusion policy was enacted in 1902. Fear of minority groups festered among white Americans. After the Reconstruction period, and was only further fueled by the influx of immigration, leading to anti-democratic efforts to restrict certain groups from voting. As immigrants flooded into the country, many of them went west as a result of the Homestead and Railroad Acts of 1862. The federal government had handed most of the lands owned by the Native Americans over to railroad corporations and white farmers, including immigrants. The Homestead Act did not require American citizenship, and the railroads sold land grants at low prices, so far as to advertise in Europe. Advances in technology such as improved plow designs meant just one family could officially farm a large area of land without need for intensive effort or hired labor. But not all farmers were happy. Increasingly, political movements like populism were drawing in hard-pressed wheat farmers of the Midwest and resentful white cotton farmers in the South, who were fed up with wealthy elites, monopolistic corporate interests in gold. Nevertheless, farming became so efficient that the country was producing more food than it could consume. So the excess was exported. This was all made possible by the expansion of railroads that had occurred in the 1850s and 60s, for they made previously inaccessible land much more feasible and profitable to work. Between 1865 and 1898, America's output of wheat increased by 256%, corn by 222%, coal by 800%, and the miles of railway track by 567%. The nation's economy revolved around the railroads, which trucked commodities like wheat, cattle, silver, and timber from place to place. The first transcontinental railroad opened in 1869. And railroads were a rapidly expanding area of the new economy. By 1890, nearly 800,000 people worked for a railroad. However, railway work was poorly paid and often dangerous. Even as wages were rising, and quality of living for skilled workers in America was outpacing that for those in England. Mechanization was steadily replacing those skilled workers with unskilled ones who could be paid less. The distribution of wealth in the Gilded Age, America was highly unequal, with the top 10% owning more than 3/4 of the nation's wealth. This disparity, along with the poor working condition, and that affected the everyday lives of wage workers, inspired a number of vicious worker strikes. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 lasted 52 days before it had to be put down by federal troops and the National Guard, but only after the fighting had resulted in over 100 deaths and workers having burned several railroad cars and engines. Another big railroad strike occurred in 1886, involving more than 200,000 labor union workers. On May 4, 1886, a gathering at Haymarket Square in Chicago to protest police brutality against striking workers turned into a riot when someone threw a bomb at police officers, trying to disperse the crowd. In the ensuing chaos, 7 police officers and 1 protester died. Searching for those responsible, police in Chicago and elsewhere rounded up radicals, labor organizers and anti-capitalists, selecting 8 men who were tried and convicted for the events at Haymarket Square. Though some found the trial's evidence to be weak and saw the convicted men, most of whom were given the death sentence, as martyrs. For many others, the takeaway from this event was heightened anti-labor sentiment nevertheless. Efforts to improve labor rights continued. In the Pullman strike of 1894, widespread striking and boycotting severely disrupted rail traffic in the Midwest. The strike occurred in response to pay cuts that the Pullman Palace Railroad Car Company made to its workers' already low wages. The company did not, however, correspondingly reduce rents and other costs in its company's town of Pullman, Illinois, near Chicago, where the majority of its workers lived. In company housing, workers and their families were starving, but the company's president refused to make any changes and ordered those that complained to be fired. The workers decided to strike. Some of the workers belonged to the American Railway Union, and union delegates found a way to support the strike. Room members across the country would boycott the Pullman Company, refusing to hitch Pullman-made cars to trains, and unhitching any Pullman cars already attached. The strategy masterminded by RU President and future U.S. presidential candidate Eugene V. Debs soon had 125,000 workers on 29 railroads quitting work. Rather than handle Pullman cars, some estimates say the number was closer to 250,000 workers across 27 states. Though the strike was successfully holding up trains, workers were still angry, and in addition, they set fire to engines and engaged in various riots. President Grover Cleveland sent federal troops to Chicago to quell the violence and obtain the court injunction, which said the RU could no longer communicate with any of its members, nor do anything to stop its members from working. Violence erupted between the striking workers and the federal troops, culminating July 6, 1874, when more than 6,000 rioters destroyed hundreds of rail cars in the South Chicago Panhandle yards. The strike only finally came to an end when the railroad started hiring non-union workers to replace those it lost. The train started moving again. The ordeal had cost the railroads millions of dollars in lost revenue and destroyed property, and the strikers had lost more than $1 million in wages. The Pullman Company was forced to divest its company town, which became part of Chicago, after the federal government conducted an inquiry and called the company's actions in the town un-American. In the aftermath of the strike, in an effort to placate still angry workers, the Cleveland administration designated Monday in September as Labor Day. But public sentiment had been stirred against the strikers, who were largely immigrant workers. The influx of immigrant workers took advantage of the growing number of industrial jobs available in cities, but these jobs tended to be exploitative and low-paying, as well even as the country's GDP became the greatest in the world. Wealthy Gilded Age moguls such as John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, Cornelius Vanderbilt, and Morgan were known for their philanthropy, but their critics also so labeled them robber barons for building their empires on the backs of an exploited working class using tactics like intimidation, union-busting fraud, and monopolies to gain an edge on their competition. Muckrakers, or journalists who exposed corruption among the elite, helped draw public attention to these issues. In 196, Upton Sinclair published The Jungle, his famous account of the grisly, dangerous, and unsanitary conditions in the meatpacking industry, which resulted in public outcry and legislation. Ida Tarbell wrote a 19-part series from McClure magazine in 1902 about Rockefeller, resulting in his Standard Oil Company being broken up for being a monopoly. Meanwhile, as the rich got richer, the cities were filling with tenements and slums as their populations grew. Another muckraker, the photographer Jacob Riis, became famous in 1890 when he published his book called How the Other Half Lives, depicting his photographs of New York City slums, which prompted city officials to try to improve the conditions there. When the Great Blizzard of 1888 dropped between 40 to 50 inches of snow on the New York area, more than 200 people died in New York City alone, most found buried in snowdrifts along city sidewalks. But in contrast to the extreme poverty, technological marvels like new bridges, trolley-lined subways, elevators, and skyscrapers were bringing the cities into the industrial age. Thomas Edison invented a long-lasting light bulb in 1879, and the Pearl Street Power Station was bringing electric light to a small number of customers. In New York City, by the light of the electric light bulb, people read newspaper accounts of the Kentucky meat shower, a mysterious event that occurred March 6, 1876. Residents of Olympia Springs, Kentucky were shocked to find large chunks of meat falling from the sky, which was never fully explained, despite attempts to investigate it. Though the favored local explanation was that it was vulture vomit. Construction on the Brooklyn Bridge, which connects the city's boroughs of Manhattan and Brooklyn over the East River, began in 1869 when it opened in 1883. It was the longest suspension bridge in the world. It was an architectural and engineering accomplishment masterminded by John Augustus Roebling, who had developed his own method for weaving wire. Cables, after an on-site accident killed him. At the beginning of the project, his son Washington Roebling took over management of the project. At least 20 workers were killed during construction, and many more were used to construct the foundations of the bridge towers. Workers toiled inside the casings, underwater, at nearly double the normal atmospheric pressure. And when they returned to the surface, had symptoms of what was then called casein disease, but today would be known as the bends. When decompression occurs too quickly, bubbles of nitrogen form in the bloodstream and can result in sharp pains, slurred speech, muscular paralysis, vomiting, and cramps. Washington Roebling, too, suffered from the casein sickness and became bedridden. Though his wife, Emily Warren Roebling, stepped in to serve as a liaison between her husband and the construction team. When the bridge was finished, she was the first person to cross it by carriage, carrying a rooster as a symbol of victory. The Gilded Age was a time of enormous economic swings, with the United States experiencing unprecedented economic growth, but also marred by economic downturns that sent prices crashing. In what became known as the Panic of 1893, problems with international investments, including failed land speculation in South Africa and Australia, and a railroad bubble caused by the railroads overbuilding and vastly out-demand LED people to make a run on banks. Withdrawing their money, a series of banks failed, and many companies went bankrupt, including the Northern Pacific and Union Pacific Railways. This led to a huge spike in unemployment. Many people also lost their life savings in the bank collapses. Numerous farms had to cease operations, and stock prices declined. People faced starvation, turning to any work they could find to help feed their families. President Grover Cleveland was blamed for the crisis, and his administration had taken heat for the way it put down the Pullman strikes. So his Democratic Party suffered big losses. During the elections of 1894, in the next presidential election in 1896, the Democratic candidate, William Jennings Bryan, was backed by the Populist People's Party, but he failed to beat the Republican candidate, William McKinley, by the end of the Gilded Age. Many people had become fed up with extreme wealth, inequality, abusive tycoons, and widespread poverty, and were ready to usher in a new era of reform when, after McKinley was assassinated, President Theodore Roosevelt took office in 1901.